This is Craftwork, a podcast by writers for writers, with your hosts, Mike Thorne
and Miriam Riche.
Craftwork is recorded and produced in Fredericton, New Brunswick, on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Wolastoqiyik, the people of the Wolastoq River.
The music for this podcast is composed and recorded by Randy Nickel Schroeder. Michael Wehunt has been a finalist for the Bram Stoker Award, multiple Shirley Jackson Awards, and the International Association for the Fantastic in the Arts Crawford Award. In Spain, his translated works have garnered nominations for the Premio Ignotus and Premio Amaltea, winning the latter. He haunts the woods of Decatur, Georgia with his partner and their dog. Together, they hold the horrors at bay. Most recently, he is the author of the novels The October Film Haunt and Nightjars. Find him in the digital trees at www.michaelwehunt.com.
Thank you so much for making the time to speak with us.
Of course. I'm happy to be here. I don't know if I should say this on the air or now, but I'm pretty impressed and intimidated by your credentials, both of you, when it comes to what you bring to this podcast. And I'm saying that as someone who has really no formal training in literature and writing and things like that. So this should be fun.
Well, we are impressed and intimidated by your writing skills.
I was going to say, yeah.
Really blown away.
We feel intimidated.
Yeah, so the feeling is mutual.
Well, cool. It should be fun then.
Absolutely.
I have been excited about this because it's about craft. And I was on, I think, 15 podcasts September, October last year. And it was just kind of the same thing over and over again. So this is different. So I've been actually looking forward to it.
Yeah, definitely us too. I know it's been a while since you've blogged, but I saw that you wrote some blog posts at some point in 2017, I think, about craft. So I think you're going to be a great guest for us.
Yeah, back when I had more free time.
I know the feeling. So without further ado, I guess we'll get started. So Michael, thanks again for coming on. We always like to ask our guests at the outset of our interviews, what were some of the books that first got you excited about reading or writing? And what were some of your earliest literary loves?
Probably my first literary love, which should come as no surprise to anyone who knows anything about me or the horror genre, would be Stephen King. I think I read Carrie when I was 8 or 9. I don't remember which one. So definitely a little too young to do so. And that started off a lifelong love of horror. And I think it instilled the passion for writing. I just had no idea yet. It would, be a really long time after that before I started to recognize it as such. I think the first writer who made me want to be a writer was Flannery O'Connor. I was born and raised in Georgia. She's from here. And so there was an automatic connection with her life and her work. And I'm not going to dwell on the problematic nature of her life, but as just what she wrote, I really connected with it when I was about 14, 15. And we read some of her short stories in, I think, the 8th grade and the 9th grade. And that just did something to me. And that was really the start of it for me. And then I would kind of go on a journey through Southern Gothic because, as I said before, I'm from Georgia, so I connected with it a lot. I was a built-in filter for it. And Edgar Allan Poe also. I remember being in my mid-teens writing my very first fiction, which I would never share with anyone now, of course, but they were basically Edgar Allan Poe pastiches, even before I tried Stephen King pastiches. So I think that's kind of interesting when I look back on it, because I would use this very, 1800s kind of language in my writing, and which I would, abandon and then move on to copying Stephen King like every other kid did. And those were my first two, and just I started reading everything by those authors that I could find. going to the library. And yeah, the rest is history. If I wanted to go beyond that, getting into my 20s, there was an author named Douglas Coupland, who I think is technically still around, but he was much, much more of a household name in the 90s. He coined the term Generation X. That's what he's most famous for. And he wrote a novel called Generation X. And that was kind of my gateway into, I guess, literary fiction, which I dwelt in for, years when I was younger. There's just something magical in his writing that I fell completely in love with. There was a lot of empathy and simplicity and just earnestness, I think, would probably be the biggest thing I would say about his stuff. Overly earnest, and I just really admired that, and I think I still carry that with me.
When I was reading the October Film Haunt, I sensed the ghost of Ramsey Campbell in those pages. The book includes a shout out to his novel Incarnate, so I felt like that was a little signal too. And I thought your novel shares some thematic preoccupations with ancient images as well, and generally recalls Campbell's uniquely masterful depictions of that eerily wavering membrane between reality and perception. Would you call Campbell a conscious influence on that novel or generally? And if so, what inspires you about Campbell's work?
He is absolutely an influence. Several years ago, I was asked to contribute a short story to a Ramsey Campbell tribute anthology, and that was a very great honor. And I had a lot of fun writing that story, although I'm not sure if he was able to see himself in it, but I digress. What I love most about Ramsey is he, probably more than any other writer, in my opinion, he's the master of atmosphere. He creates these suffocating, often surreal, often wavering between reality and surreality, kind of what you just touched on a moment ago. But more than anything, he lets the words he chooses in his sentences carry as much horror and dread and eeriness as what's happening in the story. And I've always been really fascinated by that. When I first read him, because I was pretty uneducated in the greater horror lexicon for most of my life, if I'm being honest. It wasn't until I started deciding to seriously pursue writing fiction that I waded out into the greater world of horror and wanted to know who was out there, who was doing everything, And I actually hadn't read Ramsey when I was young, which is kind of sad because he was around when I was young and he was already writing and had been writing for a while. But I was immediately captivated by how much atmosphere he creates in his work, where someone could just be walking down a street, the street lights are starting to fizzle on, and it's misting rain, and it's just a normal sequence of events between two scary moments, say, but that in-between time has just as much horror in it as when the monster pops out of the dark. And that's something that I just really, really relate to and really aspire to. You mentioned ancient images, which, yes, that is definitely up there on the influence list, but there's another novel of his called The Grin of the Dark, which involves an actor from the silent film era. And it also has a what's real, what's not real, that membrane between our world and some other sort of world and what could be crossing through it. But it's a 450-ish page novel, and every single page in that book carries the weight of dread in it. And it's the first novel I'd ever read that did that. And it was one of my first Ramsey Campbell novels. I had read a lot of his short stories, and I just remember thinking, it's amazing that someone out there, A, tried, and B, succeeded in bringing what I love so much about short fiction into a novel framework and using I'm trying to avoid using the word density because that can have a negative connotation, but I mean it in a good way. The words and the sentences and the paragraphs were like fraught with tension and suspense and eeriness and like, oh, something's not right. What is this? I'm disoriented. And it really created this swirling atmosphere throughout the whole book that really elevated it above what a lot of other writers would have done, almost any other writer, in my opinion. And just, I've never even been to England. I would love to go to England and spend 10 years there just so I can soak up this uniquely British vibe that's in some of my favorite horror. And M.R. James and so many other writers, I kind of wish I had lived in their world instead of in a more, to me, mundane environment with, more mundane stimuli. But yeah, Ramsey is great. I wish he had more of a Stephen King stature when he was young in the 80s and the 70s. But maybe he's too effective at being scary to really achieve that top level mainstream success. But I really admire that about him.
As you were talking about how Ramsey Campbell's style influenced you, talking about like atmosphere, dread, eeriness, it made me think of how to, render that on the page, the sleight of hand involved in that. And I find that your depictions of the natural world are haunting and beautiful. Your short story, Vampire Fiction, is particularly imbued with a striking sense of what you might call animacy. Here are some examples from the text proper. You write, "The stars watched him through the holes in the sky. The pleasant bitterness of the oaks and pines breathed out at him, and the sun slid behind the figure and placed it in a corona." So this kind of, like I said, agency of the natural world, which makes me think of the sublime. And so I was just curious, is the sublime something you think about? I know that's, or like that kind of natural wonder, and how does that factor into your writing?
Yeah, I mean, I know it's there. I remember when I was first starting out, because I published my first story collection pretty early on, which was not the wisest idea, but fortunately it worked out okay. And I remember seeing people point out that the natural world seemed to be alive around the characters, and like it had an ominous kind of vibe going on. And like it's not something that I'd honestly really thought about much on a conscious level at that point, but that made me start thinking about it more on a conscious level. And yeah, I've always lived near the woods. I've always had a lot of trees around me. Georgia's a very tree-ish state. And even I live in Atlanta now, but it's one of the more tree-heavy cities in America. So I just always had sort of a reverence for just the woods. And I just very naturally personify, the sky, the moon, the trees, the dirt. I've come from a love of poetry, and I think that has a lot to do with it too, because it's just my natural inclination is to personify things, because that's such a classic plot device to kind of misuse a term. But yeah, it ties back into that atmosphere aspect of writing, because I love nature. I love being in nature. I try to spend a lot of time in nature. I kind of think of a forest as like a cathedral. It's kind of like my church. And there's a reverence and a holiness almost to it. I don't know, I almost feel like I commune with it, even when I'm sitting behind my house, my dog's sunbathing, which she would do 20 hours a day if we let her. Just sitting out there with her at my day job working on the laptop, and I still feel like I'm communing with the world in some small way. And I think that just naturally comes across whenever I sit down to write anything. But in my mind, there's a poet's sort of motivation going on. But I think the top level of my mind is a little more focused on what I said before about creating atmosphere, where if it's a vampire story, not only the vampires are responsible for being scary in a horror story, I also want the trees and the moon and the stars and the hush of nightfall when something makes the insects suddenly go quiet. Like I want all these things to carry their own weight and to contribute to the eeriness. And there's a little bit of a motif in the October Film Hunt where the main character, Jory, who comes from a deep love of horror movies, that kind of sets the whole book up, basically. She talks about the moment before the moment in a horror film and how important the moment before the moment is. It's like the moment before the monster comes out of the darkness, or, whatever the case may be. And I've always put a lot of emphasis on that moment before the moment, and that it should be just as important. I'm not trying to get from plot point J to plot point K in my novel. I want the distance between those two plot elements to also be really important. And I mean that in a don't waste any words kind of way, of course, but I also mean it in a in between A and B or J and K should also have its own importance to the point where it also is a plot point in and of itself. I feel like I'm drifting off into some area that's hard to articulate.
In interviews, you often cite a deep appreciation for poetry. And I was not surprised to learn this because your prose is replete with this kind of arresting imagery and a strong sense of rhythm as well, both in sound and in sight. How does verse inform your work as a fiction writer? Is that something you could speak to a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, I've been reading poetry since my late teens, really. Sometimes I wonder why I never tried to really write poetry. It's not something I was ever that interested in. And I don't know if it's because there's some innate storyteller in me and poetry doesn't really allow much of that. But I think about poetry a lot as I'm writing. And I mostly mean that on a subconscious kind of level, because it's not like I'm actively thinking about a poem or have a poem open in front of me, but I think about rhythm a lot. I think that's obviously crucial, whether you're talking about formal verse where you have a very restrictive rhythm, or you're talking about free verse where there aren't any rules, but there are secret rules, so to speak. And, I could break that down in lots of different ways where in any given paragraph, I just want it to feel rhythmic in some way. And, sometimes I'll feel like it matches the tone of the scene or just the tone of the emotion the character is feeling in that moment, where it's mixing up medium length sentences, long sentences, very short sentences, long paragraphs with short paragraphs. A lot of that's visual as well as auditory for me. I often don't read my writing aloud. I know it's a good idea to do that. And anyone listening to this, I would recommend reading your work out loud, even if I don't do it enough. But for me, poetry is very visual as well as auditory. And I just want it to look pleasing on the page. I want my interior voice, not my out loud voice, to just catch a rhythm and then to be stumbled off of that rhythm when it's appropriate. And even within a single sentence, I'm looking at rhythm too. I edit a lot as I write. I'm a very heavy editor in the moment. When I'm editing later on down the road, it's usually more of a developmental edit rather than a line edit. I don't do a ton of line editing because I generally have taken care of that. And only when I'm making more substantial changes during a later edit will I go in and go back into writing mode and edit in the moment as though I'm writing it for the first time because I'm replacing a sentence or adding a paragraph or what have you. So yeah, rhythm's really important. And then, like I said, the imagery is already, it's all in my DNA. So I have no choice but to, I try to use similes sparingly, metaphors sparingly, but those are such timeless tools to me and they will never, ever get old. Some part of my mind's always thinking about what imagery I can bring in. I have it's really, I can't really call it a joke because it's only a joke with myself. It's the ultimate inside joke. Nobody else knows about it. But I describe the moon in a really unique way once in every story I write. This is something I try to do. I might do it 2 or 3 times in a longer piece, but I try to do it at least once. So at some point in every story, somebody has to look at the moon. It's a rule when I'm writing because I just love moon imagery a lot for some reason. And I just think imagery can really hit so hard in a poem. Why shouldn't it hit so hard in a short story or a novella or a novel? I'm not recommending that anybody think of a novel as a really long poem, but there is an element of that in there. And why shouldn't there be that element? So the way I think of poem writing is a poet, like a really good poet, will write a 20-line poem and then they'll spend hours and hours and hours just tweezing it and scraping it, almost like sculpting it. It's more like sculpture than other types of writing are. It's so deliberate, and it's turning it into this just beautiful minimal structure that couldn't be any other way and have the kind of power it does. And when you're writing a novel or a short story, you have so many more words that you're using. And yes, it's not really going to be a sculpture at the end of it, but I still like to kind of take that same mentality into it.
That's interesting. You mentioned sculpture. This is kind of an aside, not a prepared question, but I know you did some copywriting for a sculptor, and I thought that must be such an interesting way to, like we often talk about like ekphrasis. We actually just interviewed a poet who wrote an entire collection about one single sculpture. So yeah, that's just kind of interesting. I don't know. Did you learn anything big from writing copywriting for a sculptor?
Yeah, that was really my first time being paid to write creatively with like the word creatively in italics. It was really the emphasis and the desired outcome. Because the copywriting I had done prior to that was just very, very conversational and straightforward and stripped down. It was probably more for SEO value than any sort of like formal structure or anything of that sort. It was really easy to try to treat it like a poem. And one of my favorite poems of all time is The Archaic Torso of Apollo by Rainer Maria Rilke. And that poem is about a headless torso of the god Apollo. And it's a very simple, time-weathered structure or sculpture. And I'd always been fascinated with that poem because I don't know if you read it and I don't want to ruin it, but like the ending hits really, really, really hard. There are various translations of it out there because Rilke was German, but there's one in particular that just hits you like a hammer. But anyway, it was interesting to be able to write in a more abstract way and to not have anyone telling me that you have to look at this product and describe it the way it is. I could use, more poetic language. I could use metaphor and I could use grace in my writing. And I would definitely think that was several more raindrops in the growing pond of my eventual fiction writing, when I finally decided to go for it. And I dabbled a little bit before then, but I hadn't been serious about it at that time.
I feel like I maybe should have started at the top with this, but we've kind of been circling around it. But when we were preparing for this interview, you specifically told me that you are passionate about writing beyond just plot, that you're invested in writing on a sentence and paragraph level. And you've written a blog post, which we've alluded to, 10 Bullets on Writing Slowly, which sort of details your craft philosophy in a sense. And this care is very visible in your prose. So this might sound like a silly question, but it strikes me as an interesting one. Why does prose style matter so much to you? Where does this care come from?
I feel like it can be a little bit of a minefield because I write in genre fiction and I have never been in the literary fiction world, the more formal, New Yorker 10 house, MFA degree from such and such workshop. I've never been in that world, as wonderful as I'm sure it is. But I know nothing about it. And in genre fiction, there's often not a lot of emphasis placed on the quality of the prose, so to speak. And the words are more a container for plot. I think of it as like a wagon that has wheels on it. It's just pour the words into the wagon and then the wagon rolls toward what's going to happen. And a lot of books nowadays, novels especially, are kind of seem to be written hoping they'll be adapted into film. It's almost like somebody took a screenplay and they just fleshed it out and like added a bunch of meat onto the skeleton and turned it into a novel, which, if a storyteller is really, really good, that can be fine. Who doesn't like to just unplug every now and then with a thriller? I'll read a really exciting page turner and I enjoy it thoroughly and I'm glad I read it, etc. But when I'm done with it, it kind of like bleeds out of my head over the next few weeks. And then, as little as 6 months later, I might be reminded of that book and be like, oh, what happened in that book? I remember the ending, but it's just the weirdest feeling. And I think it happens with action movies too. Like years will go by and I'll be like, I don't remember much of anything about that movie. For me personally, I just feel like it's because the prose is just a container for the plot, and that the only reason it's there is just another way it might as well be a camera just showing you what happens and documenting. So yeah, you take what I said about atmosphere and the words having weight, and you take what I said about poetry, the words having rhythm and intent and, sculpture, so to speak. And both of those aspects are so important to me, and I think they can be wedded together and then joined onto plot to form one really just magnificent creation where everything has a lot of weight, everything's given equal billing. I like to think that people could read my work, and I write it in the hopes that people will read my work and not only enjoy the story, but also enjoy the prose. Because when I'm reading a really good book, I like to pause and go back and reread a paragraph because it was just so wonderful. And it's just what the author did in that one paragraph or that one sentence or that one page can just be so magnificent, poetic, whatever adjective you want to use. It stops me and it makes the story not so important for a moment. And you can more easily get away with that in the literary fiction world because often, the readers are coming to it in order to do that. And there are many, many, many different ways of writing poetry. There are many different ways of writing beautiful prose. It can be extremely plain. Some of my favorite poets use the plainest language. So I really have a lot of admiration for that. But in the genre fiction world, in a lot of cases, I'm trying not to use really definitive words right now because I don't want to cast too firm a blanket over anything. But you don't really have that attention to beauty and richness and earthiness and just focused intent on making someone stop and like, wow, that was really beautiful, or that really resonated with me. I'm going to go back and reread that, especially when it comes to my horror short stories. I would love the idea of somebody going back and rereading one or two or three stories when they get to the end of the collection, just because they resonated with them so powerfully. That idea really drives me because that's what I look for as a reader. And, a writer is nothing if they're not a reader first. But kind of a long-winded answer. I hope I got enough in there.
Oh, an excellent answer. And I'm glad you brought up reading because, at least in my opinion, you can take all the writing workshops in the world, but the most kind of ubiquitous writing advice, in my opinion, again, is that you just have to read all the time. And reading your work, it excited me, and then reading not your influences per se, but like what you like to read. I had an affinity with your taste because I'm always looking for something that kind of, straddles the line between a certain atmosphere of dread, but like the content itself doesn't necessarily need to be horror. And there are a lot of writers who have one-off short stories or whatnot that address this. It might not necessarily represent their entire body. So yeah, all this to say, your taste in literature is incredibly eclectic and specific. In an interview with Gwendolyn Keist, you list, and this is going to be a long list, you list Flannery O'Connor, Stephen King, who you already mentioned, those two, but you also mentioned Laird Barron, Annie Proulx, Vladimir Nabokov, Eudora Welty, William Faulkner, Joyce Carol Oates, Cormac McCarthy, Agatha Christie, Stephen Graham Jones, Reggie Oliver, and those are only the prose writers. That's not even mentioning the poetry writers. So I'm just curious, like maybe you already answered this, but what is the like je ne sais quoi, so to speak, that you look for as a reader?
Yeah, I think I'll probably just repeat myself a lot, but my really very favorite writers, and a lot of the ones you just named in that old list, aren't going to fit into what I'm saying here. but this is not a rule really, but a lot of my very favorite writers have what I personally think of as an earthiness in their writing. Even using such a specific word as earthiness, I think even that has a pretty broad palette and it can be done in many different ways. But I would actually say Nabokov has an earthiness. And basically, what I mean by earthiness is just blending plain and poetic language, or using plain language more to create poetic imagery and resonance and emotions, and just to create that feeling I mentioned where you pause and you go back and you reread a paragraph or what have you. But people like Nabokov, Raymond Carver is at the top of the list when it comes to that. Just, I don't know, I feel like I have my fingers in the soil when I'm reading his work. There's something so special, and he's like using long sentences and he's using punctuation oddly, and there are too many clauses in the sentence sometimes. Same thing with Cormac McCarthy in a very different way. Flannery O'Connor, Carson McCullers, William Gay, Toni Morrison. I think she has a lot of that earthiness. I think even someone like Joan Didion. Joan Didion has a very flat way of writing sometimes, but it's always rich and gorgeous at the same time. And I'm like, how did she do that? And so I pause and I reread, and it'll take me 2 weeks to read a 280-page book by her. And that's the way I want it to be. So I think that's one really big commonality. And I think earthiness is especially applicable to Southern Gothic fiction, because it kind of sprung up as a genre to almost specifically be concerned with the earth and the soil and the sweat and the grime of life in the earlier 20th century American South. So it just kind of like slots right in there. But also, a lot of my reading incorporates horror, unsurprisingly. And a lot of the writers I love, they're really, really wonderful prose writers, like, Laird Barron, who you mentioned, Peter Straub, Gemma Files, Ramsey Campbell, Robert Aikman, M.R. James, one of my all-time favorites, Stephen Graham Jones, Joel Lane. These people have the word earthiness could start to get strained a little bit to the breaking point, but I still really stand by it, because those writers tend to choose their words carefully and they're weaving atmosphere into their words so that the writing is almost a character in the story. Whether it's a first person narrator, a third person, omniscient third, close third, whatever the case may be, the words themselves, rather than just the narrative voice, are a character in the story, and they're also trying to make you uneasy and unsettled. You don't really hear horror versus weird fiction kind of dichotomies like you used to, like a decade ago, but I'm very much a weird fiction person. And I think that's because all the things I love in prose lend themselves very easily to weird fiction, where its intent isn't to spray blood on the wall. It's not to tear arms off. It's not to have someone go up against a monster and have good versus evil and battle it out to see who will come out on top. And it's just about these eerie things pushing through some membrane into our world, and what the hell is that? And maybe you can't know what it is. Maybe it's more of a Lovecraftian, beyond human comprehension kind of thing, but I love all that stuff too. And I like inscrutability and ambiguity. I love surreal imagery, and just anybody just with the ambition to tackle all these different things I've been talking about, I'm probably going to be really drawn to their work. And I think someone like Flannery O'Connor, if you read The Violent Buried Away, her less famous novel, there are points in that book that really read like cosmic horror to me, where, you have the preacher father character near the beginning of the book. The way he relates to God is so much like a character in a Lovecraft story in a cult relating to Cthulhu or something, just to use the more obvious touchstones. Flannery O'Connor never wrote horror, although I would argue she went right up to that line many, many times. There's so much horror in her prose. That was just an automatic hook for me from the beginning.
It's nice to hear someone mention the violent bear it away. Wise blood tends to crowd it out, but I love the violent bear it away too. Several of the things you're talking about here, I would love to hear you discuss more, like this notion of inscrutability, the kind of supremacy of sensation in your fiction, also the supremacy of like the ineffable or those things that are right kind of at the borderlands of language. I'm thinking about a 2017 interview you did with Little Red Reviewer, where you note that, quote, scaring people, unsettling them, building dread is one of the most challenging kinds of word crafting, unquote. And I would agree with that. And I was curious if you could speak a little more to this idea of translating sensation into prose. Like, have you developed any techniques over time that you have found helpful? Could you speak to that idea of like this affect that horror is named after? How do you approach this as a writer?
I do think all that's fascinating. One way I think I do it is what we talked about before, by having the world around the character kind of come to life through personification, and just to think of everything as having its own weight, its own, almost in the story world, almost an autonomy, where there's something living about it, even if it's a stone or a candle or whatever. One thing I actually almost struggle with at times is I have such a natural affinity for the elements of nature around me, around my characters that I'm writing, that sometimes I really have to remind myself to focus on the tactile sensations and the mental reactions of the characters in these very small moments. I love inscrutability so much that I can almost have a tendency to feel like the reader also does, which, isn't. One thing about being a writer and learning as you go along is learning the differences between you and your reader, and your template reader, the reader you imagine. I think any writer should have more than one template reader, because you're going to have, when I publish a book, especially now that I'm a few books into my career, when I publish a book, I know that I kind of have a built-in audience, and those are people who are, really into weird fiction. They love Robert Aikman. They love, Ramsey Campbell. They have read my work previously. They're on my wavelength. They're vibing with me from the start. So they already have a proclivity there. And then there's another template reader that's just maybe this is their third horror book, and they don't really have much of an appreciation for it yet, but they're interested, and they're not used to the typical levels of this or that, and they're probably even less likely to be into weird fiction, so inscrutability will be a harder sell for them. So I think along the span of a larger story, whether it's a 8,000 word story or an 80,000 word novel, it's important to remember those people, those readers, and just to keep in mind that why I don't need to know what's happening to a character's body, because I'm focused on the eeriness of everything around them. It's worth my time to take a moment and to, write a sentence about how that made the character feel in that moment, especially in a less close third person environment where I'm not drilling into the character's head at every moment. How did they react to this? In my mind, they're kind of just being like, oh, wow, I'm simplifying it to the point of silliness, but like, oh, wow, this is so weird, I can't explain it. But there are a lot of readers who do want it explained and maybe even need it explained. So I have to make the character take an extra step on the page to contemplate that or whatever, and to have goosebumps appear on their arms and whatnot. I'm trying to remember everything that was packed into your initial question, because I wandered off on a tangent and kind of lost my way.
I think you're right on track. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right on track. You're speaking to something very nuanced here with regards to this idea of template readers is really interesting to me too. Like the difficulty you're describing in maybe the object of sensation versus the subjective experience of sensation. I feel like you've addressed it really well.
I just feel like you started off with question A, and then I immediately latched on to question B and forgot about question A.
Okay, let me go back to my question here and see. I think I kind of began the question by talking about this idea of the inscrutable or the ineffable, which, as you say, it's interesting to think about like the tensions and overlaps between weird fiction and horror fiction, which I think exist in the same house. They're maybe in different rooms, but I think they visit each other's rooms pretty frequently too.
Right. Yeah, the ineffable, that's definitely the part I forgot as I was rambling along. Sometimes I feel like if I were left to my own devices and had, if I were going to publish in micro presses for the rest of my life and I could truly write whatever I wanted, I would just write about the ineffable all the time. I would have a lot of ambiguity. I would have a lot of poetic awe where nothing is understood. And I can get away with it in my short stories. So I haven't had time to write many short stories the last few years, but I know that I'm going to go back to them in the future because that's where I can still do those things and not have to even think about whether or not I'm allowed, so to speak. But when you get into novels and, I've been fortunate enough so far, like, I published my first novel last year. My second novel's coming out this year. And I've been fortunate enough to be with a big 5 publisher. And it's definitely a whole different set of rules. It's a different machine. You have so many more people sticking their hands into your work. And it's definitely been a learning experience. It's been really fascinating. But to me, what's the scariest things in the world are the things that we can't explain, the things that just are so weird and strange that they just defy almost words themselves. And I do have this one fascination where I like to take a trope of some sort that really isn't associated with horror at all and make it horrific. Like I wrote a novella about a mime. I wrote a short story about Cupid, the classical little demigod of love who shoots people with arrows and makes them fall in love. Like, I just take these things and I try to turn them into my own horror archetypes. And the ineffable comes into that. It's like transmuting this into a whole new context is really fascinating to me. And it can really generate a lot of strangeness and a lot of uneasiness. And again, it comes back to atmosphere too. Like, creating something so strange should spill into the words themselves. I don't know, there should be great beauty in horror also. And that ties into my sense of the ineffable and my grasping for the ineffable and the unexplainable and even the horrific and the things that make that chill dance up my arms, which is a feeling I've been chasing my whole life because for me, it's pretty rare. And just to be able to imbue words in a way that can cause that chill to go up someone's arms is just like, it's a drug that I'm always trying to score. From a student perspective, I would recommend just try being aware of the construction of sentences and paragraphs and just to put a little more care into what a sentence is doing in terms of rhythm, in terms of imagery. Spend a few extra seconds per sentence on word choice. Try to put a word in there that isn't like a $50 word or isn't ornate or purple or anything like that, but just I really like using very plain language personally, but just using a word that wouldn't usually be used in that context. My novel that's coming out this coming September, I'm obviously going to be really vague here because the book hasn't come out, but there's a moment where someone has extremely long fingers and I describe them as pianist fingers because to me in that little moment, in this one little sentence, I just felt like describing the fingers as someone who plays the piano is just such an unexpected way to convey how these fingers are freakishly long. And if there are any pianists listening to this right now, I'm Not trying to say that about your fingers. I'm sure they're very normal length, but in this context, it struck me as a nice way to describe these fingers as being longer than they should be. And it's just, one of dozens or hundreds of little choices that I make that, for me personally, just make a lot of difference within the context of a story.
I definitely see that in your work. I personally have an appreciation for work that I would describe as kind of self-contained, by which I mean to say, like, well, you brought up your story about mimes. I read that, The Tired Sounds Awake, and I thought that the manner in which, to make the pianists feel better about their fingers, like, you took the kind of classic Breton shirt, like the striped, kind of, we associate it with France, I guess, shirt of the mime, and yeah, I mean, mimes are a little creepy. That makes sense. But you kind of took that symbol in an otherwise very like economical story, and it kind of reappears. I think there's a scene in which a woman's like nightgown appears to be striped, but it might be a trick of the light. So you set up the reader to look for something that's kind of been defamiliarized inside of the story. And then it's eerie, but only in the context of that story. It's not necessarily eerie when you encounter it on the street. So I really appreciate that. Like, Cupids or mimes are a little more inscrutable too. They're not vampires or werewolves. Like, they're a little more neutral. Although, I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of people who find mimes really creepy. The Cupid's it's a little weird looking, I guess. But a baby that shoots you, I don't know about that. But like, all this to say, I think you're also using these creatures or phenomena as techniques or metaphors about the themes of the story. So I found, especially in The Tired Sounds Awake, like, it had so much to say about writing without being like metafiction. Like, we typically talk about writing advice in terms of technique and process, and I find it's much rarer, but like equally important to discuss the difficult work that goes into creating the conditions for a successful writing practice. So in that story I mentioned, The Tired Sounds Awake, I was struck by the manner in which it addresses questions of sacrifice and responsibility surrounding the pursuit of creative production, which is just like, yeah, an interest. I know I'm kind of segueing from talking about your story to talking about something it stands for, like a thematic that's going on in it. But I was just curious to hear you maybe speak a bit about what you've done to create conditions for a successful writing practice in your own life.
Yeah, I think that story really came from a place where I was thinking about my partner, who at the time I had probably been with, I think 7 years. It's 15 now, but I think 7 at the time. And I was thinking about how I was more and more pushing into a place where I was taking my writing career seriously. And I was always thinking about, like, what was that going to mean for my day job? What was that going to mean for my work-life balance? What was that going to mean for my relationship? And even what was it going to mean for my dog? Because, my dog needs certain things from me, and could I provide those things and that attention and that time? So, like, what sacrifices was I making in my life in order to have what was more and more looking like a second job? Because, like, second job is scary, and I didn't want to treat writing like a hobby because it wasn't a hobby to me. So I think that story came from a place where I was looking at the sacrifices my partner was making, and then I imagined this kind of construct where she would discover this creativity that she had never known, and starts becoming an artist herself, and what that would do to me. And it just like started firing off all these synapses. As far as how I built my writing practice, it was very slow for a long time. It's really only picked up steam in the last few years. I've always had pretty modest goals and target points. Just write 500 words a day, and on Saturday, the weekend, I try to write 1,000 words, and then I take Sunday off, so I don't have any work on Sunday, and I can just, I don't mean that in a religious sense. It's just, until recently, my partner worked Monday through Saturday, so Sunday was our only mutual day off. So it was always nice to set that up as a day that we could just have for ourselves. That's about 3,500 words a week, but extrapolated over the span of 9 months or so, you could write a novel. So I found that to be pretty effective for a while until I wrote my first novel and sold it, and then everything changed. And I still try to adhere to that when I can, but now I'm in a world where I'm writing a long form book, and I'm also working on edits for the previous book that's, about to be in production on its way to publication, and fielding emails from the marketing person, people asking me to be on podcasts and to do written interviews, and readers reaching out. And there's the admin aspect of being a writer really started to pile up in a way that it never had before. And so I've had to do a lot of soul searching, which I'm still doing. And it's like right now I'm just telling myself, just keep exhausting yourself and we'll see how it goes. And as time goes by and I get, my second novel is going to be a little easier than my first. My third is going to be a little easier than my second. I'll get used to all the machinery of New York publishing. I will become more at ease and less stage frightful in podcasts, which, I've done a lot of them now. So I think I'm already getting to that point. You mentioned writing practice, but for me, this is the hardest stuff. It's like not the sitting down and actually putting words on a page. It's the time management and stress management and not getting burned out and not letting it affect my day job, not letting it affect being able to take a walk every day. I've been in situations where a novel was due or edits were due, and I had to work from 7 a.m. until 10 p.m. for a week straight, and then I'm just completely wiped out and almost fractured in a way. And then I need a lot of time to recover from that. And it's not very great in a long-term sustainability sort of way. So I would just advise other writers, and I have advised other writers, to just really focus on figuring out your own personal time management, your own personal stress management, find out what self-care works for you, and just really give yourself permission to have those things. Take your moments to yourself, go outside and touch grass, as the kids say. Those are the hardest things for me to do. And as far as like the writing itself, I used to have to write in silence. I couldn't have anything going on around me. And then I started incorporating music, and that really helped. And I could only write when the music had no lyrics or no vocals. And then, like as time went on and I just did it more and did it more, now I can put on a Smith's record in the office while I'm writing, and the Morrissey's words don't impact my writing at all in the moment, and which is nice. And I really adapted to a lot of things and really gotten myself to a place where I can just go anywhere, sit down and write if I have to. I still do a little better if I have my curated environment, but I think that was really important for me too, because I'm not always going to be in the right frame of mind. I'm not always going to be having a good day. I'm not always going to be this or that, but just practice makes perfect. And, being able to just write a little bit, even if you don't like it, is very valuable. And it keeps that momentum going, and it makes it less likely that you will skip tomorrow. Sorry to get kind of logistical there, but for me, that's always been the things that I need to tackle the hardest and really work on.
It's reassuring to hear you describe some of these things, because, you've reached a level of success that I would aspire to. And I was mentioning to Miriam the other day that I feel like every day I sit down to write, and I've been writing for my whole life, basically, over 30 years. I feel like I still have stage fright every time I sit down, but invariably words do come out. The writing does happen. It's just a matter of telling myself, regardless of what my brain might think it wants to do, you just sit down and you do the work, you put in the hours, and it does happen somehow. As you were speaking, I was also thinking about the way you are in conversation with other writers. You list a lot of writers in the acknowledgements page for the October Film Haunt, including several who offered notes on an early draft. So I wanted to ask you, what's the value for you in exchanging work with other writers? And how do you decide when you're ready to solicit that kind of external input?
Yeah, when I was first starting off, and I'm sure a lot of writers would listen to this and nod and agree, it's probably pretty universal. But when I was first starting to write short stories and submit them to online magazines and anthologies and things like that, I felt like I had to have two or three or even four different people read the story and offer me feedback. And that kind of thing's always valuable. But, as I went forward and started becoming more and more sure of my work, I kind of stripped that down to just a couple of, very trusted people. Because if you have a day job, you're not going to have a lot of time to read other people's works, because if I'm not reading a book, like for pleasure reading, I'm gonna go insane. I'm not gonna hold myself together. I'm gonna fall apart. That's just the way I've always been since I was a kid. But like to have a day job and then to write fiction after the day is done, and then to read your peers' short stories, and then to also have a book that you're reading for pleasure, there's not really room in the day for that if you also want to have a life where you interact with humans. I'm in a place currently where I don't get to write short stories. That's a different thing that maybe I'll mention in a moment. But when I write a novel now, like the one I just finished a few months ago, my agent read it, my editor read it, and that was it, you know. And I'm currently in a place where those are the only two people who need to read it. Although technically my second novel has two editors, so three people read it. But yeah, I still put a lot of value on my peers' opinions and constructive criticism. And I remember early on, it's difficult because a lot of people have a tendency to, they read my story and praise it and offer a couple of points of criticism. And then I read their story and I feel like I have to just praise it and offer a couple of points of criticism. And it's really difficult when you see potential in a piece of writing, but you feel like it needs a lot of work, and you almost, you go into a developmental editor sort of mind frame, and how do you convey these things? And that's why it's so important to find your trusted handful of beta readers that you can kind of tear apart when you get something new from them, and they know that they can tear you apart when they get something new from you. That's going to have a lot more value than having 10 or 15 people read something you wrote who aren't on the same wavelength and don't have the same level of mutual trust going back and forth. When you're asking somebody to read something, you kind of want both of you to have that, not just line editing perspective, but like digging in with a shovel, developmental editing kind of mindset. And with the October Film Hunt, it was actually the second novel I wrote, but the first one's just, I thought of it as a practice novel, and it probably deserved to just be that and just to sit in its musty corner of the shed out back. But when I wrote the October Film Hunt, I had a couple of people read it, and I admired them in different ways. One of them was an old trusted beta reader. Anything I write, I can just give to him and completely put my faith in him that he'll give me his honest assessment about all the different aspects. And then there was Nabin Rethnam, who I know was a guest on your podcast not too long ago. I asked him to read the book, and he had never read anything in first draft form from me, but he and I had communicated a little bit back and forth over the previous few years, and I just saw something in his work that was very different from mine, but that I thought could really inform mine, because he had written stories that were kind of in that horror, weird fiction overlap on the Venn diagram, but then he had also written thrillers, suspense thrillers under a pseudonym. And that just really fascinated me. So I asked him if he would read it, because I thought he could give me feedback. And he's also done a lot of screenwriting. So that's something else that not in my toolbox. I thought that might be helpful. And he came back with a sort of feedback that I don't think I would have gotten from anybody else I would have asked to read it. So I appreciated that I thought of these people, and because I thought they had different tools that they could bring to the book, and they would each look at the book in a slightly different way from the other. And there's a lot of value in that. So, pick your beta readers wisely, I think is a good way to go at, and don't get too comfortable with your friends. If they are your friends, make sure they'll be mean when they should.
Absolutely. Honesty hurts, but that's the only way to get better. That's really interesting. It makes me think of, you're just talking about selecting readers earlier on. I guess when we were talking about inscrutability, we all have to acknowledge like that our work is not going to be for everyone. And I know this is like a little older. I know that you did this blog post back in 2017, but it's making me think of the blog post you did called Don't Get to the Point, in which you expressed annoyance regarding a genre fiction market pressure to telegraph the speculative element at a story's outset. And I really like that you don't do that in your work. And I really like Neben's work. I also find it kind of more quiet and filled with dread as opposed to like overt and immediate. So I was just curious. Obviously, like I said, you wrote this almost a decade ago. Do you think this rule still applies in 2026? Or are there any other market pressures that you resist giving in to?
I think it does still apply. My initial thought was to say it applies more today, and then simultaneously to say it applies less today. Horror is just more popular than it was almost 9 years ago. It's having a moment and all that. And I think one aspect of that that's not really talked about a whole lot is you've had a lot of writers from other genres jump over to horror because it's more popular nowadays. Just like you're seeing a lot of writers currently jumping into romantasy or horror romantasy, which is like the triple portmanteau, because like that's the biggest selling subgenre right now. So a lot of people are trying it out. So I think a lot of thriller writers, mystery writers, science fiction writers, fantasy writers, and I think crucially, a lot of literary fiction writers have been coming over into the horror umbrella in recent years. So I think you're seeing a lot of different methodologies and practices being brought to horror, which is changing it to some degree. So I would say the rules that I was commenting on back in 2017 probably don't apply as stringently as they did then, because horror is more amorphous now and it can be pushed and pulled in different directions. However, I do get the sense that for the most part, the most successful horror novels nowadays often feel the safest. Like they take fewer risks. And to be even more apt, I would say a lot of them just read like thriller novels that have horror injected into them, where, if you made this monster, whatever, human, it would just be a thriller novel, and you just have to tweak a few plot elements along the way. I'm not accusing anybody out there of writing a thriller and then editing it into a horror novel. I don't really think that's happening, but it kind of has the same sort of vibe. And I just think that's because of that please adapt this into film kind of mentality that a lot of authors seem to, I won't say that about authors, but I feel like a lot of books seem like they were written with that mentality and that hope. It's funny, like years before I started writing fiction in any sort of serious way, I had kind of planned out or sketched out this novel idea where it would be 100% a literary novel with nothing speculative or genre about it in any way. No thriller, no suspense, no mystery, or no mystery that's like the linchpin of the book, I should say. No horror, no this. And on the last 2 pages of the book, it turns into a horror novel and kind of recast everything that's come before. And I just don't think that would be doable. I don't think anybody would publish it. I think if it were done really well, and I haven't tried it, so I don't know if I could do it well, but I think if it were done really well, and it were published, it could be really successful and really awesome because it would really pull the rug out. It's almost like The Sixth Sense if the little boy hadn't seen any other ghost in the movie and it was only the end when all that comes out. I think it could be really successful. I just don't think that anybody would take a chance on it because what would you even say in the jacket copy? And a lot of times, what's on the jacket copy kind of dictates what a book can be because you have to sell it to people before they read it. So you can't hide the ultimate intent of the book from the reader. So I don't know. That's really just a weird anecdote I threw in there, but books are expected to be so streamlined nowadays. I really wanted the October Film Hunt to kind of push back toward an earlier era where books could be a little bit denser and a little bit longer and a little more layered and have more POV characters because I miss multiple POV characters used to be very common and they're really not anymore. And I had this hope that I could here's a novel with 5 POV characters, there's a main character and then there's a secondary character. The other ones are much smaller in the scheme of things, but they have their POVs as well. So I feel like this 1 to 2 POV characters, very streamlined plot, very stripped down, very just get to the point, don't linger anywhere, don't take risks, don't spend too much time on the prose. We want it to be a wagon full of words that just carries the story along and nothing else. Those are the kinds of things that I like to think I don't fit into and that I would like to push back on. But at the same time, I have to be pragmatic. And so I've been recently thinking of my novelist career, however it pans out, as being perhaps an interesting journey of figuring out how I compromise with these various elements along the way. My second novel is a good bit shorter than my first. I'm planning out my third one right now, and I'm thinking it's going to be shorter than the second, so I can feel myself capitulating in that regard. But the most important thing is that I can feel myself wanting to capitulate, and I would continue to do so until I didn't want to, and then, I would course correct because I ultimately want to write what I want to write. But I also want to take market concerns into account because, at the end of the day, I'm a small business. I'm a business. My intent is to get people to read these books. So I have to write something that they'll want to read. So I could write stuff only for myself, but that's stuff that I would never put out into the world. So we'll see how that all goes. But I want and I hope to write challenging, rewarding fiction that has a great story, but also lets people just pause and reread paragraphs. I keep saying that over and over again because it's like a valuable callback for me. But wherever the trends go, I just will meet them halfway when I think it allows me to keep my own integrity the way I define that in my own mind. But I love all my readers and I want to make all of them happy. So that's how I see my journey right now.
Again, so many things that I'd love to hear more from you on. One of them is this notion of like the polyphonic horror novel, which of course recalls, I guess, what some people would call the golden age of horror fiction of the 1970s and 1980s. And I see the October Film Hunt kind of in conversation with that tradition. That's part of how I read it. But it is also a highly contemporary novel in many ways. Like it's drawing so much on the textures and formats of online life, also the language of online life, Reddit threads, blog posts. You incorporate figures like Trevor Henderson and Sadie Hartman, both great people. How does the internet inform your approach to narrative, to genre, and maybe to writing more broadly, if it does?
I think nowadays, it's almost like you draw a line as an author and you tell yourself, if I don't want to have to worry about the nature of truth and the nature of a character's personal reality and the reality of the people that are impacting them, you really need to set your book in the 90s or the early 2000s or the 1820s or whatever the case may be, because if it's 2010, 2015 or after, like I think most novels still take place like today. Like when you open up the book and read page one, you can generally assume that that's right now, or a few months ago or a few months in the future, it's right around right now. I typically like to write in the contemporary now of, whenever I'm publishing the book or story. But the influence of the internet has really impacted the world so powerfully that I think authors really should pause and think about how it has affected the story that they're writing, because the elements of the plot itself, but certainly the characters and their mentalities and their decision making could be impacted by the internet. The October Film Hunt, so much of it is kind of concerned with that line between fiction and reality. I basically took a folklore figure, I invented a folklore figure for the internet era and wondered if people would believe in it. And I kind of see the greater evil of the internet these days being the erosion of truth and the elevation of misinformation to the point where it's gotten to a place where what you believe is more important than what's true. And that's utterly fascinating, utterly horrifying. I don't know what it says about our future, but with AI here, it's just going to get even uglier. And I'm really glad I wrote the October Film Hunt before AI just glooped all over us in every nook and cranny of our lives, because I would have had to make it a different book, honestly. But I was just really fascinated by the fact that if someone wants something to be true, it almost has an occult power and it almost becomes true if enough people believe in it. We see it in the headlines every day where things that are demonstrably clearly not true are believed to be true. And there's nothing you can say, no amount of truth you can present, facts, science, what have you, that can make that person see the truth. And so how does that relate to a horror context? I thought about demonology and the occult and how this could all tie into the occult. It was just really interesting. And so I think anyone writing in a story world that has the internet in it beyond like 2014 or so, I would just say, be really careful, because you could have people in your story who won't trust what they see on the internet. And so much of our information is disseminated via the internet. We get our news from the internet. We find out what that other character is doing because we see them on Facebook posting something. Like crucial story information can be relayed and sometimes kind of has to be relayed through the internet. And characters do research. Back in the golden age of horror, the character would go to a library and do research, and there would be like music playing and almost like a montage, and they would make a breakthrough and they would figure out key facts or whatever during their library montage. That's all done on the internet now. You could escape a zombie and then pull out your phone in the woods and be trying to look up something relevant to the plot to figure out why there was a zombie, or whatever. Wherever you are, you can be online learning about your story world. And so you really have to be aware of that and aware of how untrustworthy so much of the internet is and the impure way information is passed along and interpreted and absorbed and disseminated. The internet's really impacted our psyches. It goes far beyond just pop culture references and memes and stuff like that. Like you want your story to feel like it's of the internet age, but character motivations and dialogue and like motivations of everybody there really should feel like they exist in an internet world. I think the blurry line between truth in fiction has just gotten so weird, and that makes writing fiction harder, in my opinion. So if you want to play it safe, set your book in the 90s. But if you want to be contemporary, I would also recommend kind of embracing the internet era and all of its implications. And I tried to do that in the October Film Hunt, so I'm a little biased, but use it to make some social commentary, kind of dig into it a little bit. And you can even have a little bit of fun by being epistolary and using different found materials that were clipped off the internet to really drive your point home. And to, that kind of thing can be really valuable for exposition. You could use a Reddit thread or an excerpt from a news article to throw some exposition, so you don't have to have your characters do it. You don't have to have a big block of text in chapter 4 that's loaded down with exposition. So yeah, stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, as you've pointed out, the internet is a place of great horror in many ways. This is just an aside, but Mike and I, in our free time, like many people who love horror, watch a lot of true crime, and we watched a documentary about a very tragic story about 2 young girls who believed in the Slender Man and attempted to murder another young girl. And this is very nerdy of me, but Jack Zipes, who's like an 85-year-old fairy tale scholar, like he is one of the preeminent scholars on the Brothers Grimm, was in the documentary talking about, how the Slender Man is kind of like a new iteration of, and I was just like, oh, that's so cool. This man's like 85 years old and he's kind of still engaging with what folklore or fairy tale mean in the age of the internet. Anyways, that was just an aside. I just was excited about the way you were talking about it, and it fits in. I just love how much you kind of draw upon myth and kind of archetypal, the timelessness of certain archetypes. So it sounds to me from speaking to you that you're in a place of writing novels, not as many short stories lately. And obviously titles apply to novels too, but short stories, you have to come up with them more quickly. So this next question is about titles. I'm a fiction reader for a literary journal here in Canada, and I find I can anticipate the quality of a story based on its title. So, titles are very important. They're kind of up front and center when you're looking to accept or reject something. Once again, a long time ago, you did an interview with Jose Cruz in which you stated that a title often comes to you before its corresponding narrative does, and that you tend to let a story name itself rather than the other way around. So I'm asking, as someone who struggles a lot with settling on satisfying titles, I actually find it to be one of the hardest parts of writing short fiction. I'd love to hear more about kind of this gift you have, I guess, and if you have any title tips or guidelines, tricks, rules of thumb for listeners.
Yeah, I mean, for me, there are occasions when a title can just be super boring. Like I wrote a story once that was probably still the weirdest story I've ever written. So I gave it a really mundane title. I think that kind of balanced that out. It's going to sound weird, but it's basically about again, coming back to sculpture, the clay head of Lionel Richie in the music video for Hello. That sculpture is haunting various stories in this horror anthology. Don't try to parse that. Just I'll move on immediately. But the story is heavily drenched in Lionel Richie and the song Hello. So I just called it Hello. Because I don't know, it worked somehow. And, the October Film Hunt, I think it's an evocative phrase. I wrote a short story called The October Film Hunt Under the House many years ago. And it's very different from the novel, but it was the origin story for the novel. And at the time, I just thought it was evocative in some way, like October, film, haunt. Those are 3 very horror-esque words. They fit together really well. They resonated with me. And then I kind of balanced that by choosing a horror movie title that the story would revolve around, something very mundane, as like Under the House. And I actually came up with that before I even conceptualized the house in the story. One of the many fake movies that's referenced in the October Film Hunt novel is Dead People's Things. To me, that's very mundane, but it's just really powerful for me. I've always had and actually, I'll go ahead and segue into this point. I borrow a lot of story titles from musicians that I love. Like I've named a lot of things after Brian Eno works, like An Ending, Ascent, the production company in the October Film Haunts called Another Green World. And Another Green World gets referenced a lot. That's a Brian Eno album. I know there are other examples. The Tired Sounds from The Tired Sounds Awake is from The Tired Sounds of Stars of the Lid, this like orchestral ambient group that I love very much. So there are a lot of things I borrow and pay homage to, and I'll usually try to put something in the story that's like honoring them rather than just stealing the title. Sometimes I like a title that's just kind of nonsense, like On and On from there's a story in my first collection, Onanon, one word. It was just me smushing the words on and on together into like a gibberish word kind of. And then I have a story called Halu, which is just the word hollow misspelled. And I came up with that before I started writing the story, and I just made the story fit that word, that messed up word. But what you read in that interview is true. I often do choose the title first because the title will come to me, or an image will come to me, and then the title will come onto that image. But I really only want it to be evocative in some way, and because it often comes first, I want it to make me want to explore what it means. But again, it's like a story title could be something that I would want to be in a line of poetry. You know, like would it belong in a poem? If so, then I would use it as a title for something. As long as it's evocative and intriguing and hopefully carries a little weight to it. I have so many mundane titles, so don't think of anything I just said as like a rule of any kind. I have a story called The Pine Arch Collection, which is just this film project that a group in the story is making. And so I just, that's the obvious title, and it worked for me. And the Pine Arch from the Pine Arch Collection is from a Stars of the Lid track called the Artificial Pine Arch Song. So again, stole that. But yeah, just, don't wholesale steal, like steal and mold it to your own self.
We always like to, at the end of the interview, ask, have you read anything recently that has particularly excited you? It could be new or old.
One poet I really like is Louise Glück, and I've never read her collected poems. So I have had it for a couple of years, this big, beautiful, thick book, and I'm finally reading it from front to back. With a very prolific poet, that's hard to do because you're talking 800, 900, 1,000 pages. But I'm trying to read that whole book this year, and I'm about halfway through, and just absolutely incredible. I read Ripeness by Sarah Moss. I really like her a lot, and I would suggest somebody start with Ghost Wall, one of her earlier novels. It's really great, and it's not horror at all, but I feel like it exists in a horror mode, in a weird fiction mode. It could almost be a book that like Robert Aikman wrote, except that there's really nothing horrible or evil or monstrous or horrific in it. But it's just something about that book carried a lot of power. Her new one, Ripeness, is really good too. I read Coffin Moon by Keith Rosson not long ago, and that's just a great 70s sleazy vampire novel. It's like post-Vietnam War biker bar type of vibe in it, but Keith is a really good writer, and I recommend reading that on a craft level too. Why am I blanking? I always seem to do this because I know this question's coming up in almost any podcast I do, and here I am blanking on what I've read recently.
Every single one of our guests blanks, so you're not alone.
It's like I just finished a book a few days ago, and I enjoyed it. Well, anyway, about 4 months ago, I read The God of the Woods. I liked that book a lot. Liz Moore, I liked her previous novel, Long Bright River, which is like a police procedural kind of a thriller novel, but written in a very literary fiction kind of way. So everything I've said up till this moment, it's obvious that I would be intrigued by that. And the God of the Woods is an even better book. Long, dense, tons of POV characters, but I think because it's not genre fiction, I grumpily say she's allowed to do that. But that was a really, really great book. It's weird. It takes place in the Adirondacks in upstate New York at a summer camp deep in the woods, but she very rarely describes the forest or the water or the like canoes on the water, the different types of trees, the flora, the fauna. She doesn't really use any of her writing to bring those to life. But I was fascinated by that disappointment mixed with how much I enjoyed the book. So that was really fascinating. And there was a book I just finished, and actually, you know what? I have it written down. I keep a list of the books I wrote. And since I'm not on video, I can just grab this. Yes, Beings by Ilana Masad. I would definitely call it a literary novel, but it's framed as a science fiction novel. It is about a couple, and it's based loosely on true events. A couple in the early 1960s who were abducted by aliens. A UFO followed their car as they were driving in the New Hampshire mountains, and something happened to them with this UFO, but their minds were kind of erased. They don't remember what happened. So a lot of the book is about their struggle to remember and tell their story and to deal with how people treat them after they tell their story. And then it's also about a queer science fiction writer, also in the 1960s, who is heartbroken, and she's writing, her whole story is told through letters to somebody, and then her story kind of starts to intersect a little bit with the story of the couple. And then wrapped around all of it in the present day, there's a library archivist who is fascinated with both of these stories. They're a non-binary character. They're kind of making themselves an unreliable narrator. Anyway, it was a really good book, and it was very slow going. It's not a quick paced book in any way, but I enjoyed it a lot.
This has been really delightful. I feel like I learned a lot from you today, so makes me excited to go hit the word processor.
Your
Yes.
pedigrees are so impressive that I think it made me want to level up a little bit. So,
Well, likewise, your
Yeah.
track record, your sense of craft is like, I was blown away. I was like, very, very unique voice.
I enjoyed everything thoroughly, and I've already become a fan of this podcast, so I think you guys do a really good job of choosing a diverse range of guests. And even if I don't just listen to the horror ones, I've started listening to all of them and trying to, soak up all this different stuff. And I really appreciate that. So thank you.
Thank you for
Michael.
listening.
Yeah, means a lot. And thank you for taking the time. It's like genuinely a privilege to get to speak with you for, I guess it's almost been 2 hours. So thank you. I know you're busy. You're a busy person.
Yeah.
So appreciate it.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. And this is the first podcast I've been on since late October. So I was refreshed for this one.
I love to hear that. That's great. Well, hopefully you get lots of writing done, more writing than podcast guesting. I mean, that's, writing is where it's at, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So
If somebody had told me at the beginning of all this that it would be so public facing and so social, and I honestly sometimes wonder if I would have even started on this path, because it is so public sometimes. It's really weird, but I don't know. At least the main thing is still solitary, so I still have that. But now I'm having to figure out which events I'm going to go to with my limited PTO time, and I'm like, I want to go walk along the coast in Maine. I don't want to go to a convention and talk to 7,000 people. It's weird. Being a writer is weird in ways I'd never anticipated.
There's also like the necessity to network and stuff like that. We're also both, at earlier stages in our careers, and I find that stuff exhausting. Like it just takes everything out of me. But I suppose it's all important.
Right. Just as long, I just hope we all don't end up being considered content creators, because that's where it feels like it's going. And I'm not a content creator. I want to be an artist. That's my intent. And those two worlds don't align so Lego block like as many people assume. So but we'll see. It's all about trying to balance and figure it out along the way, and necessary evils and necessary goods. I'll stop rambling about that.
Oh, we love it. No, it's true. I mean, yeah, you don't really get to pick your medium, but I think like you need something to express yourself with, and it could be sculpture, just so happens to be writing for the three of us, I suppose. And it would be nice if it's just, yeah, I don't want to be adding to the glut of slop on the internet. So, yeah. Well, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your Saturday. It has been a privilege to speak with you, Michael.
I enjoyed it so much, and I hope you too have a great weekend.